doing?
So in February we had Cluster Development School, which was held after the national competition, which was in November 2016, and we selected 115 managers who are willing to become cluster managers and develop cluster initiatives in their regions. So in your opinion, what is the role of cluster manager, and what is the concept of this role?
Firstly, I'm excited by the scale. When you talk about these sort of numbers of cluster managers, I want to go, hey, bravo, Ukraine. What is the role of these people? Firstly, the role is to help companies move from silos, moving to exploring where might they lever with others. So moving over time from wanting to protect everything, almost being in a castle, to engaging with others. And a key concept here, a key word here, is co-specialization amongst firms. So helping firms work through where, in non-threatening areas, they can collaboratively engage with others, which could be as simple as sharing freight. Or it could be, I've got a machine that does something special, and you've got a machine that does something special. Can we use each other's machine shops? So a culture of collaboration amongst firms, this is one of the key things that this cluster manager, this key person, and this person is a connector, is a catalyst, so helping link the firms, but also helping to link support organizations like technical institutes, like government departments, like university research. So helping to build the whole ecosystem around a firm to support the growth of those firms. So this magic person, this cluster manager, is the key person. It's the person who is on the ground in the different regions of Ukraine, acting as the catalyst, acting as the connector.
And after acting as a connector, what should be the next steps of these cluster managers in order to not just introduce the relevance of cluster initiatives in their regions, but in order to really develop them?
And the cluster manager firstly needs to develop personal trust with the key organizations, the key businesses and the support organizations, because cluster development really is about bringing people together rather than institutions. So firstly, the cluster manager needs to build trust with the key organizations, particularly the key businesses, and then be in a position to bring those businesses together where there are common agendas. So this person really is the trust builder, the connector in that region.
Mm-hmm. And you, as a recognized expert in the sphere of competitiveness, yes, as the founder of TCI Networks, actually, what is your opinion about Ukraine? What should we do in order to raise our level of competitiveness? And what concepts should be in mind of people around our country in order to raise that?
What you're exploring in the Ukraine is what is happening in my home country, New Zealand, across Europe, across North America. Particularly, it is exploring within each region. What are the activities that are already successful, that are already strong? What are the activities within a region that are pulling wealth into that region? So a first step of cluster development is to identify what are the patterns of activities that are pulling wealth in. And that might be because we're a grain producer and it's grain farming, and maybe there's agricultural machinery that relates to grain. Or it could be over time we've become a specialist in wedding dress manufacturing. Or it could be IT related. It's understanding what are the activities pulling wealth into our region, and then understanding how do we build from that. So it's not dreaming about what haven't we got in a region, but rather fundamentally understanding what do we already have and how do we grow out from that.
And you have mentioned that in a cluster initiatives it's important, it's all about collaboration, cooperation, yes? And if we speak about the concept of competitiveness and especially Ukraine as a country and as a system, how can we launch or how can we gain this cooperation between governments, academy, that is universities, yes, and science, and actually public sector?
Let me come back on the word cooperation, because sometimes I feel we go overboard with cooperation. It is healthy for firms to compete, because that forces individual firms to innovate, to explore new products, to explore new markets. We want competition, but we also want to create an environment where firms are able to explore where might they work together, where might they move from a culture like this to a more open system. So when we talk about cooperation, it's not everybody hugging each other, but rather working through where by engaging together can we really lift the competitiveness of our firms and of our regions.
So I suppose that according to your answer, it's like changing their minds, yes, minds of these people in the terms of their attitude towards different companies, towards different unities, etc., right?
Nice expression. It's about changing minds. It's about changing the culture. It's about firms realizing that they don't have to do everything themselves. They don't have to be, in an old-fashioned sense, vertically integrated, where everything is within their factory, but rather firms able to say, actually, what I'm good at doing is this bit. So I will focus on that, and I will perhaps outsource, subcontract other things that enables me to focus on my specialization, on my core competency. So it's a culture change amongst firms. It's a culture change often amongst government organizations, where particularly government organizations need to be able to better listen to what really are the needs of those firms, rather than from up high somewhere deciding, well, this is the support that we're going to offer you firms, so just say thank you and get on with it. So it is creating the dialogue, it's creating the conversations, and this is where this magic person, the cluster manager, comes in to create these conversations, to bring people together, but accepting that some firms, hey, quite naturally, they don't want to share everything, but to work through where can they open up, and how do we build the system? How do we, in a sense, build a bigger pie? So, and then the slicing of the pie becomes a lot easier.
And when we bring these people together, afterwards, what are our next steps? What are the next steps in terms of what different approaches, etc., should we use in order to change, to move on the system, if we speak in terms of a country, especially?
And often as we bring people together, we realize there are common agendas, perhaps agendas that relate to importing some raw materials, perhaps agendas that relate to export and export documentation training, or perhaps working as a team and promoting in a trade fair in Germany. Perhaps there are common issues that relate to training, some new technical skills that are needed to run some new machinery. So it's exploring where are the common agendas, and some of those agendas are open and across the whole cluster, but other agendas could be private. Maybe it's just your business and my business quietly collaborating. Perhaps it's sharing staff, sharing machinery. It's not for everybody. So describing collaboration here at different levels, private collaboration and more open collaboration, perhaps training, for example. Perhaps putting together a website to help the cluster reach to the outside world, to help generate inquiries. A website perhaps that helps generate inquiries from international investors that are thinking, well, I make textile machinery, where might be a place in the Ukraine for me to invest? Maybe it's that place that makes wedding dresses. So in different ways, it's blowing the trumpet and working through where do we blow the trumpet and how do we blow it? And how do we create an environment that enables particularly the small businesses as well as the large businesses within our cluster to grow?
And who should be leading, actually, this online platforms or these attitudes that you have mentioned? Who should lead them? Who should right now just stand up and go ahead for this financial initiatives, etc.?
Well, we've talked about this cluster manager, and the question in part is who resources, who finances that cluster manager? And often it is some form of local government, sometimes supported by a national agency, sometimes with an NGO or an international agency coming in to support. Often there's a multiplicity of agencies that are co-funding that person. But important to me that that person reports to the businesses, because the clustering initiative really needs to move at the speed of business It needs to be driven by business. So it really shouldn't be driven by the person that is funding the initiative, particularly if they're a public agency. The public agency should be comfortable in participating in the discussions, but not determining the outcome of those discussions.
Okay, thank you for that last question. And if we again come back to the concept of competitiveness, yes. Actually, what kinds of failures or mistakes can be made at the first steps, yes, when we're just aware of this concept and we want to move forward with that, but actually what mistakes should be avoided at the start, yes? So you are an expert who have worked with numerous governments, etc. What are your suggestions?
I've made many mistakes.
So you're an expert with that.
And I would be embarrassed to share some of them with you. But let me say this, important in cluster development as we start, that it's not paralysis by analysis. It's not spend 3 months, 6 months writing a report about XYZ cluster. Yes, we need to get an understanding of who do we have and what are some common issues, but important to me that we quickly engage. So a term I use here, let's find some low-hanging fruit. Let's find some easy projects, easy activities that we can engage on. And often I find as we engage on those and demonstrate to firms that this isn't a talk fest, this is something that does have some impact on the bottom lines, often the firms are willing to open up a bit more as to what really are the issues, what really are the opportunities, the roadblocks that are facing those businesses. So big mistake I've made is go for a few things at the top of the tree early on, rather than let's get something going quickly on market development. Let's get something going quickly on training. Let's get something going quickly that helps promote the businesses.
And I suppose that those low fruits for different parts of a triple helix, they are different, right? So some fruits are from government, some fruits. So what are the varieties and what are the key fruits for those parts of the triple helix?
And you're using a key term here, triple helix, with 3 partners, but particularly it is business-led. But we need to have public agencies there. And it could be a number of agencies that are relevant to a particular cluster, and the range of agencies will vary from cluster to cluster, and important to have academia there. And academia, such as the business school, but it could be technical training that relates perhaps to sewing or relates to adding value to grain. But it could also be high schools in the community, where kids at the high schools are doing practical things that relate to baking bread, or practical things that relate to wine, or relate to engineering. So it's triple helix, and again emphasizing important that it is business-led. And again, the initiative moves at the speed of business and is comfortable in learning by doing.
So in terms of, if we see like academia, yes, Kyiv Mohyla Business School in part of Kyiv Mohyla Academy, yes, as this part. And then we have cluster managers who are graduates for cluster development school and who represents their regions. So how can we go on to the level of governments, and how could we work on a triple helix in order to raise the question and the concept of competitiveness?
The triple helix really needs to engage in the region and around that specific cluster. So you need to, from Kiev, as it were, from the capital, as you're well doing, it is introducing the concept, it is training people, and then almost saying to them, you go out there and deliver. And part of what the cluster manager needs to do is to bring together around their cluster the relevant triple helix players to make that cluster purr, to increase the competitiveness of that cluster.
And what methods or approaches in raising up the competitiveness of their clusters, perhaps some just key points as an expert, yes, so more practical ones if we just number them one by one for our cluster managers in order they are aware of their next steps in their regions.
A key thing for a cluster manager, please spend time out with the real people. And by the real people, I mean the businesses within the cluster. You can't do this by email. You can't do this by being on the phone. You've got to sit down and eyeball. You've got to understand what are the pressures for each of those businesses. So often a question I ask as I'm meeting with the CEO of a business is a question along the lines of, imagine you could double. Imagine you could double your turnover. What needs to be in place for you to double? What's holding you back from doubling? Is it thinking about which would be my first export market? Or perhaps thinking about where would I get the staff? Or woohoo, the bank manager would be a problem. So understanding by talking to the key people, by talking to the CEOs of the businesses, what are their pressure points, what are their issues? And then from that information coming back with areas where there's opportunities for collaborative engagement, areas where it makes sense for people to work as a team rather than individually in silos in addressing those. So encourage the cluster managers as they start. Spend time in the field. Please, that's where you should spend most of your time. It is out talking, it is listening, and using that knowledge then to bring, maybe it's 2-3 people together for a private conversation, or maybe it's a large group bringing them together to talk about training.
So we speak that on the first steps, it's like bringing just people together for a cup of coffee, etc., just in order to launch this idea, to introduce this relevance of cluster initiatives. And what steps should these cluster initiatives, when they are on the first steps, yes, in their regions, what should they do in order to go on the level of a country and to raise the competitiveness of a country as a system, yes? How should they further go to the government or representatives of the government in order to introduce this idea?
And what a cluster initiative provides is a mechanism for a group of firms to engage, be it with the government, be it with training organizations, be it with the local mayor. It provides a mechanism where they can work through what really are the priorities. So people are not listening to a whole lot of different views. There is a discussion forum to work through what really are the pressure points and how do we engage. And again, the role of the cluster manager is to bring people together to explore that. So describing here cluster development very much as bottom-up. It is not the more traditional top-down economic development. And bottom-up, where we are linking the key businesses, the support organizations, to find the common agendas. And it's not writing a report, but rather in a very practical way, it's let's do something about it. Once we've got an indication that, yep, we need to move that way, let's start rolling. And we can then adjust as we start moving, rather than, oh, hold it, let's just wait until we know exactly which way to go.
So thank you for this idea of let's start rolling. I think that we can end up this interview with this idea, yes, because it's so optimistic and gives us a sense of further steps. But perhaps you could share with us your agenda for this week in Kiev. What are your plans and what are you going to do during this visit?
I'm impressed with what you guys have built in terms of the structure for my 3 days here. Great to be having a day with the developing agricultural cluster, the food cluster. I've just spent a week in Wales in the UK with their food cluster, and I will be sharing that knowledge. Great to be meeting with a number of the cluster managers to explore what's on their agendas, perhaps to explore what do they see as some of their difficulties. Great to be meeting with 5 mayors and some of the cities that they are representing, to explore in a practical set way. How are they engaging? What might be some of their obstacles? So in a very practical way, what we're doing this week is taking this concept, we're moving it down from balloons up in the sky to, okay, now, how do we engage? And how do we engage in a wide number of regions across Ukraine? And I get a buzz out of that. So it's a pleasure to be back here.
And it's a pleasure that you are here, and it's a pleasure to have this interview with you. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
You're always welcome to Kiev.
Thank you. Thank you. You were gentle with me. Thank you.